Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Today, I wanted to put together a list of some of the unique items that have already proven themselves early in early access. This is not going to be a video talking about items like Astromantis and Headhunter and Ingenuity that are super expensive and that are known to be chase items. Instead, we're going to be looking at unique items that are on the budget friendly end. Except for the last two items on this list, everything is going to be super budget friendly. And even those last two items are definitely going to be affordable once you're solidly at endgame. Some of these are going to be endgame focused items, and some of them, like the one we're going to be starting with, Wanderlust, are items that are useful from early in the game. I also need to make a general point first about Vaal Orbs. Vaal Orbs can do some really interesting, weird and wonderful things with unique items in Path of Exile 2. You'll see here that the explicit modifier that provides movement speed has just a flat 20% to 20% roll range. So why is it that there are some that are 24%? That's because in Path of Exile 2, Vaal Orbs do different things to unique items to what they used to do in Path of Exile 1, and even to what they do to rare items in Path of Exile 2. One of the possible outcomes that they can have, and this is often the most desirable one, is they boost or nerf the numerical effect of each modifier on the item by up to about 22%. The exact mechanics I'm not sure of, but when we get to Enfolding Dawn in a sec, you'll see that they go up to 22% on that item. Now, for Wanderlust, this means that if you get really lucky with a Vaal Orb, you could hit 24% movement speed. And if you are going to apply Vaal Orbs to a Wanderlust, make sure that you do the right thing, like this person has done here, and apply a socket first. Use an Artificer's Orb on the item first, then and only then apply a Vaal Orb. Because you wouldn't want to have a situation where you get 24% movement speed, but the item is forever bricked and unable to gain a socket on it. But in terms of the base version of this item, 20% movement speed is nothing to laugh at. It is a better stat in Path of Exile 2 than it was in Path of Exile 1, and it was a really good stat in Path of Exile 1 too. And on top of that, the 5 dexterity just feels way better than it's got any right to, because it's a stat you've got to get somewhere in order to use your support gems, and you may as well get it for free on a set of boots that you're already going to wear anyway. Wanderlust, super budget, super powerful item at level 11, and it stays relevant up to about level 50, after which point you're going to start looking for something better than it. The second item we're going to look at is Enfolding Dawn. This is another one that you can use from very early in the game, and it is something that is far more powerful on minion-based characters than it is on anything else. Minion-based characters scale their offense through the stat Spirit, and Enfolding Dawn gives you 100 Spirit on your chest piece, and it's a chest piece that you can throw on from the very beginning of the game. However, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Enfolding Dawn has a very real drawback on it as well. Intelligence provides no inherent bonus to maximum mana is a really serious drawback. This is something that's not going to have much of an impact early in the game, but the further that you get through the game, the more problems you're going to start to have as a result of this mod. Mana in Path of Exile 2 is something you need to keep scaling up, and the intelligence boost is something that's significant in helping with doing that. So, very, very real drawback here. But in exchange for putting up with that, and also in exchange for having basically no real defenses on your chest piece, you pick up 100 Spirit, and you also pick up 5 to 15% to all elemental resistances. Additionally, if you get lucky with the Vaal Orb on this, you get 122 Spirit, and you can also potentially get as much as 18% to your Tri resistance. Both of these are good individually, and if you got both of them together, it would be phenomenal. What I recommend you do, if you want to use Enfolding Dawn on a character, look for ones that have 14% to all elemental resistances. The 14% Tri-Res ones are really cheap, and they're not much worse than the 15% Tri-Res ones. This is not going to be endgame gear anyway, so it's perfectly fine to just use the 14% version instead. The next two items we're looking at are both boss drops. Now, there are bosses in this game that people run chasing certain specific chase items, but they have a largish loot table, and that loot table includes a number of items that are still quite useful to equip, but that are just not worth very much because these are the things you get when you don't get lucky. These are the things that you get when you don't get the thing you're really chasing. Xoph Blood is one of these items. Xoph Blood is an incredibly cheap item, and it's also incredibly good. This is one of the few items in Path of Exile 2 that has percentage increased maximum life on it. Now you can get this in a few places, but the game is just really stingy with this stat. It's not Path of Exile 1 where any endgame build has at least 120% of this stat on the tree, maybe 170%. There's almost none of this available on the passive tree at all, and as a result, it ends up being closer to more maximum life than it is to increased. 14% increased maximum life, that's a big stat to have. It can also be boosted by life catalysts, and the roll range on this is 10 to 15%. 15% ones are not budget. 15% perfect rolls tend to go for about a Divine Orb, but even a 14% is available at a super budget price of 2 Exalts. Next, the item comes with fire resistance on it. Path of Exile 2 is just really stingy when it comes to resists. You've got to get them somewhere. You may as well get them on an item that would already be good enough to use, even if it didn't have that stat on it. And finally, enemies in your presence, i.e. within 8 meters of you, have fire exposure. You only want to use Xoph's Blood if you are primarily dealing fire damage to enemies, but if you are primarily dealing fire damage to enemies, there's a lot of power here. Now, you are giving up a couple of important things by using Xoph's Blood. It's got to be said, you can't get Spirit on this amulet the way that you could on a rare amulet, and you can't get plus X to the level of a class of gems the way that you could on a normal amulet either. So there's a very real cost to using this, but I do think that Xoph's Blood massively outperforms its price, especially early into endgame, and it's something that can help you get your character established, get you going until you get one of those really good rares. Now, while we're talking about unique items that are really good until you can get yourself a much better rare, let's talk about the Pandemonius. The Pandemonius also drops from the same boss. This also comes from Zesht, We Who Are One, from Breach. It's also something that's somewhat of a waste product. People are going into the Twisted Domain because what they want is either passive points to add to their Breach tree, or they want one of the items that comes up when Zesht is fought at a higher level, and they're probably pretty disappointed to get the Pandemonius as they're dropped from Zesht. However, their loss can be your gain. This item has a decent chunk of resistances on it, 20 to 30% to cold resistance. It has this line of text, blind chilled enemies on hit, which is really useful but not super powerful. But the main thing it's got is damage penetrates 75% cold resistance. Now, in many circumstances, this is all the penetration you need. This is the entirety of the suppression of elemental resistances that your character requires because you're dealing almost exclusively cold damage, and this is going to get rid of all of the resistances on most monsters. Now, I do need to mention how elemental penetration works because it is different in Path of Exile 2 to Path of Exile 1, and this might cause you to think this item is better than it is. It is still a good item, but if you're reading this with Path of Exile 1 interpretations in your mind, you're going to think it's absolutely stellar, when in fact it's just good. So, in Path of Exile 2, firstly you apply everything that lowers the monster's resistance, so this can be things like the Frostbite Curse if you elect to use that. It can be things like cold exposure. Apply all of these. If the monster's resistance is now 0 or negative, then elemental penetration doesn't work on it. If the monster's elemental resistance is still positive, then penetration applies, but penetration only brings it down to 0. So to take an example here, let's imagine a monster that has 50% cold resistance and you use the Pandemonius. You don't have anything like Frostbite, so you're not actually lowering the resistance, you're just simply applying Pandemonius. Now, you penetrate up to 75% cold resistance. It doesn't have 75%, so this effectively lowers it down to 0. If instead your Pandemonius read penetrate 30% of cold resistance, then you would treat the monster's resistance as being plus 20 because it's 50% and you're lowering it by 30% to plus 20. That's the way that elemental penetration works. It's still a really good stat, but it is not going to get the monster's elemental resistance effectively below 0. So it's going to deal with problems that high elemental resistance on a monster can cause you, but it is not going to escalate your damage further against monsters that have 0 already. The next thing that I want to call out is Enezun's Charge. This is very much a one-trick pony item, but that trick is really strong, and that means that Enezun's Charge ends up being a really, really powerful item because it's so good in one particular build. This is a caster wand that has increased spell damage, increased critical hit chance, but not that much on it in terms of general damage for spellcasters. Yeah, the increased spell damage is nice, but it's nothing compared to even a middle quality rare, much less a good rare. But it has this line of text, 25% chance to not destroy corpses when consuming corpses. So what's good at consuming corpses? The answer is Detonate Dead. What would you want to use in conjunction with Enezun's Charge? Well, I want to show you a little bit of build tech from LNYM, and this is a guide that I think is quite interesting to have a look at. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. But he uses the Reservation Sacrifice, which reserves 60 spirits, so it's a non-trivial cost. But while it's active, your undead reviving minions can be used in place of corpses by your skills. Then it has a drawback, your minions revive more slowly. That's the starting point, Sacrifice. Then use Skeletal Brutes, because they just have intrinsically a very large amount of hit points. And then use Detonate Dead. Detonate Dead is lots of fun when you've got lots of corpses. And the other thing that's really interesting here, and this is the thing that makes Enezun's Charge so good, is that Detonate Dead has a pretty low mana cost when you first get it at gem level 7. The mana cost does go up over time, but it just doesn't scale as aggressively as a lot of other spells. So if you're using Enezun's Charge in conjunction with Detonate Dead, you end up in this situation where between Detonate Dead and Corpse Conservation and a few things on the passive tree, you get quite a high chance for your corpses not to be consumed, i.e. for your minions not to be consumed, and you can chain cast Detonate Dead on the same particular minion of yours multiple times in a row. There's a lot of power on this item, but the other thing I really want to point out is that this is a fantastic Vaal Orb target, because 25% is a lot worse than 31% when you've got a whole bunch of things that additively stack with this, and so you end up getting much better scaling than it looks like. Enezun's Charge, if you can Vaal it and get 31%, it becomes even better, but it's fine as it is. Now, I feel like that's something that's a bit too specific, so I wanted to go with something that is more of a general caster item, and this is something that provides a large amount of spell damage in a caster offhand, but it does so without crangling your mana. There's a lot of things that you can get as a caster offhand that will do a lot of extra damage, a lot more than Threaded Light will do, but then at the same time, they add a whole bunch of mana cost to your skills. Threaded Light provides a huge chunk of added spell damage, at least if you've got a lot of spirit on your character. So it has a text 8 to 12%, or potentially even higher than that with a lucky Vaal Orb, to spell damage per 10 spirit on your character. That would already make it worth using if you've got a decent chunk of spirit, and you can get a decent chunk of spirit with or without going to Enfolding Dawn. Enfolding Dawn's sort of going all in on this concept, but you don't necessarily need to go quite that far in. And then Threaded Light also provides you a whole bunch of mana regeneration rate. So that's a powerful setup. Threaded Light is an item that I think is really good on a budget. You'll see here that if you insist on getting 13% increased spell damage per 10 spirit, you're going to pay for that. But if you're willing to settle for 12%, which is the natural roll, then you can pick it up much, much cheaper than that. The next item is something that is a little bit more speculative. Beetlebite is not currently a really strong unique item on a budget. It's something that's definitely budget friendly, but it's not currently strong. The reason I'm adding it to this video though is that it has a lot of potential if one or two specific game changes get made. Currently, there's not a lot of people having success with bleed in the game. The ones that are mostly doing close range attack builds. However, there's a lot of support on an entire ascendancy for that matter, the Blood Mage, around a spell-based bleed archetype. This is not currently good, but any game changes that make that into a good archetype are going to suddenly make Beetlebite exceptionally good. Aggravate bleeding on enemies when they enter your presence means that if an enemy goes from more than 8 meters away from you to less than 8 meters away from you while it is already bleeding, then that bleed is going to become aggravated. Aggravated bleeds treat the monster as permanently moving until the bleed expires. And when a monster is moving, bleed damage is doubled to that monster. So there's a lot of power potentially there. However, Beetlebite also has something else going for it as well. That is that it's got quite a bit of movement speed on it. This is one of the highest movement speed uniques with a roll range from 20 to 30%. What happens if you apply a Vaal Orb to this? Well, you can potentially get as high as 36% movement speed. This is the reason that Beetlebite really jumped out to me as something that has a lot of potential. This is an item that can have genuine endgame movement speed on it, but at the same time can also do something truly unique, aggravating bleeding on enemies from quite long range. The problem is that at the moment, the Blood Mage bleed ascendancy option isn't considered very good by a lot of players, and for fairly good reason, but all it needs is a couple of game changes that make that into a good ascendancy and a good setup, and then suddenly this Beetlebite package looks like it's got a lot of potential. So I wanted to add that in there, even though it is more speculative than everything else on this list. Now, I did mention that the last two unique items we're going to discuss are not quite as budget as the others. The next item we're going to take a look at is Sekhema's Resolve. This has 3 different versions, and you can't turn one of the versions into another through the use of a Divine Orb. They're just independent versions from each other. They're all thematically very similar. Each one has 10 to 20% increased item rarity. Each one has 10 to 20 to all attributes. And I would say that in most cases, the all attribute stat is probably the more important of those two. So you look for one that has 20% to all attributes, that's going to be a really good starting point. Then it has the ability to socket a jewel into the ring. And the color of that jewel, so whether it be an emerald, whether it be a ruby, whether it be a sapphire, that dictates the resistance modifier that you get. The resistance modifier reads, fire resistance is unaffected by area penalties if you're using the ruby version, and there's also a cold version and a lightning version that have other gems that are available for them. That is a big chunk of resistances that you're getting from this ring, as well as a big chunk of attributes, as well as rarity, which is a more powerful stat in Path of Exile 2 than it was in Path of Exile 1. And on top of that, you're getting a dual slot. Ultimately, there's just a lot of power here. This comes only from killing the boss of the Sanctum and only when you're using one of the relics that makes the run harder. As a result, I don't think it's ever going to be super cheap, but it's also not expensive. So keep this one in mind. It's something that's a little bit less budget than everything we've covered so far, but there's a lot of power there. And finally, we have a unique item that can drop anywhere in the game. It's uncommon rather than truly rare, and it's quite expensive in comparison to other uniques because it is just so good. This is the Everlasting Gaze. So leave aside this one that's listed for 1 Exalt. That's either a mistake or a bad faith listing. The rest of these are in the 1 Divine plus range and often quite a bit more than 1 Divine. Now this is an item that simultaneously solves a lot of mana problems on your build and at the same time provides you a whole bunch of defense. 20 to 30% of your maximum mana is added as extra maximum energy shield. This can be a lot. You can get a lot of mana on a character. And at the same time, it's giving you 50 maximum mana and up to 80% total mana regeneration rate. Finally, this is something that qualities extremely well. Mana quality will affect 3 of the different mods on this item. Unfortunately, it won't get the most important one. So you'll end up getting no boost to the mana granted as extra maximum energy shield. That is only a defenses catalyst. But the mana regeneration rate, both the implicit and the explicit mod will get a boost, as will the total maximum mana. So that's one option that you've got. Or alternately, you could go with the defenses catalyst instead. Most people aren't doing that, but it's not something that the game prevents you from doing. That's the Everlasting Gaze. This is the last of the items that I'm listing in this video that are somewhat budget. And this is something that's more accessible than it looks. It's more common than its price would make you think. It's just that so many people want it, so many people want to use it, that it ends up still holding a bit of value despite being relatively accessible. That's all I got on this. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results, especially when you use them on uniques, and I will see you around.